A Kingdom United. New York, 1917. Vivian Price unearthed an old wristwatch in a dusty drawer, its hands frozen at 5:37 p.m. and bearing the inscription Lieutenant Edward Burns, marking a moment time forgot. Chapter 1. The Timekeeper's Secret. The attic air hung thick and still, a suffocating blanket woven from dust motes and forgotten memories. Vivian Price coughed, a delicate, almost apologetic sound that barely disturbed the silence. Sunlight, fractured and pale, struggled through the grime-coated windowpane, illuminating swirling particles in its weak beam. She ran a gloved finger across the surface of a chipped porcelain doll, its painted eyes staring blankly ahead, a silent sentinel of a childhood long past. This was her grandmother's house, a relic of old New York, crammed with the detritus of generations. She was here on a mission of sorts, a bittersweet pilgrimage to clear out the remnants of a life lived, a life now ended. Vivian's grandmother, Beatrice, had passed away peacefully in her sleep just a week prior, leaving behind a house overflowing with the echoes of laughter, whispered secrets, and the lingering scent of lavender and old paper. Beatrice had been a formidable woman, a suffragette in her youth, a tireless volunteer during the war, and a fiercely independent spirit until her last breath. Vivian had always admired her, even feared her a little. Beatrice had a way of looking at you, a piercing gaze that seemed to see straight through to your soul. The task before Vivian was daunting. Every drawer, every cupboard, every dusty trunk held a potential treasure, a potential heartache. She'd started with the smaller items, the trinkets and keepsakes that could be easily sorted, easily discarded, or, if worthy, easily kept. It was in one of these drawers, tucked away in a corner behind a stack of yellowed linens, that she found it. It was a man's wristwatch, heavy and substantial, the leather strap cracked and dry with age. The glass face was clouded, but beneath the haze, Vivian could make out the hands, frozen in time. 5:37 p.m. Or was it a.m.? It was impossible to tell. She turned the watch over, her heart quickening slightly as she brushed away the dust to reveal an inscription, etched into the tarnished metal, Lieutenant Edward Burns. The name meant nothing to her. She'd never heard her grandmother mention an Edward Burns. Vivian carefully wound the watch, her fingers trembling slightly. It resisted at first, the mechanism stiff with disuse. Then, with a faint click, it began to tick. A slow, deliberate tick-tock that seemed to resonate in the quiet of the attic, a heartbeat from the past. She held it to her ear, mesmerized by the sound. It was a strange, unsettling feeling, as if she'd awakened something that had been sleeping for decades. She examined the watch more closely. It was a beautiful piece, clearly expensive, even now. The style was military, she guessed, judging by the sturdy design and the lack of ornamentation. Lieutenant Edward Burns. Who was he? A lover? A friend? A brother? Her grandmother had never married, had always claimed to be wedded to her causes, to her independence. But Vivian had always sensed a hidden sadness beneath Beatrice's strong exterior, a quiet melancholy that hinted at a past she never spoke of. The discovery of the watch sparked a curiosity in Vivian, a yearning to uncover the story behind it. She felt a sudden, inexplicable connection to this unknown lieutenant, to the moment in time captured by the frozen hands of his watch. It was more than just curiosity, it was a feeling of responsibility. As if she owed it to him, to her grandmother, to unravel the mystery. The war. It had to be connected to the war. The Great War, they were calling it, though Vivian couldn't fathom anything great about the endless slaughter being reported across the ocean. The newspapers were filled with casualty lists, with stories of heroism and horror, of trenches and gas attacks. America had finally joined the fight, sending its young men to a distant battlefield, and the city was gripped by a feverish patriotism, a mixture of fear and excitement. Vivian herself felt a detached sort of anxiety about the war. She knitted socks for the soldiers, rolled bandages for the Red Cross, and attended rallies in support of the war effort. But it all felt distant, unreal, like a play being performed on a faraway stage. Now, holding this watch, this tangible link to a soldier, a lieutenant, the war suddenly felt closer, more personal. She decided, there and then, that she would find out who Edward Burns was. She would trace his story, uncover his connection to her grandmother, and perhaps, in doing so, uncover a piece of her grandmother's hidden past, a piece of herself. The attic, with its dust and its shadows, suddenly felt less oppressive, less like a tomb, and more like a starting point. A journey had begun, a journey guided by the ticking hands of a long-lost watch. She carefully placed the watch in her handbag, a tangible weight against her thigh, a constant reminder of the mystery she was determined to solve. The afternoon light was fading, casting long shadows across the room. As Vivian left, she glanced one last time out the dusty window at the sun-baked city beyond. Somewhere out there was an answer, and in the ticking, she heard not the echo of death, but of a life once lived, of duty and maybe, just maybe, love. She did not know where the watch would lead, but knew, with the first stirrings of fear, that the destination was already set. Chapter 2. Whispers of the Western Front. Vivian's apartment, a cozy haven nestled on the Upper West Side, felt different now. The familiar comfort of her books, her paintings, the soft glow of her lamps seemed to hold a new, almost unsettling, stillness. The watch, resting on her bedside table, pulsed with a quiet energy, a constant reminder of the unknown journey she had embarked upon. She started her search the next morning, a crisp autumn day with a sky the color of faded denim. Her first stop was the New York Public Library, a grand, imposing building that always filled her with a sense of awe and possibility. The vast reading room, with its towering ceilings and hushed atmosphere, was a sanctuary for seekers of knowledge, a place where the past whispered its secrets to those who listened closely enough. Vivian approached the reference desk, her heart beating a little faster than usual. A kind-looking librarian, with spectacles perched on her nose and a gentle smile, greeted her. "How may I help you, dear?" "I'm trying to find information about a soldier," Vivian began, her voice slightly hesitant. "A Lieutenant Edward Burns. He served in the Great War." The librarian nodded, her expression understanding. "Many families are searching for their loved ones these days. Do you have any other information? A regiment number, perhaps? Or a date of birth?" Vivian shook her head. "Only the inscription on his watch. It just says Lieutenant Edward Burns." The librarian's brow furrowed slightly. "That makes it more challenging, but not impossible. We have casualty lists, regimental histories, and various other records. It will take some time, though." And time it took. Vivian spent hours poring over dusty volumes, scanning endless lists of names, her eyes growing weary, her hopes slowly dwindling. The sheer scale of the war, the sheer number of men who had fought and died, was overwhelming. Each name represented a life, a story, a loss. She found several Edward Burnses, but none that matched the rank of lieutenant, none that felt like the right one. Discouraged, she took a break, wandering through the library's grand halls, her mind still racing. She found herself in an exhibit dedicated to the war effort, a collection of photographs, posters, and letters from the front. The images were stark and powerful, soldiers huddled in muddy trenches, nurses tending to the wounded in makeshift hospitals, devastated landscapes scarred by shell fire. The letters, written in faded ink, spoke of courage, fear, longing, and loss. One photograph, in particular, caught her eye. It showed a group of officers, standing stiffly in front of a bombed-out building. They were young, their faces etched with a mixture of determination and weariness. One of them, a tall, lean man with dark hair and a penetrating gaze, bore a striking resemblance to the image Vivian had conjured in her mind of Edward Burns. She studied the caption, "Officers of the 16th Infantry Regiment, near Ypres, 1916. Ypres. The name resonated with a chilling familiarity. She'd read about the battles fought there, the horrific conditions, the staggering casualties. A wave of nausea washed over her. Could this be him? Could this be the man who had owned the watch, the man who had somehow touched her grandmother's life? She returned to the reading room, renewed determination coursing through her veins. She focused her search on the 16th Infantry Regiment, delving deeper into the records, tracing its movements, its battles, its losses. She learned about the horrors of trench warfare, the constant threat of snipers, artillery fire, and gas attacks. She read accounts of bravery and sacrifice, of men who had faced unimaginable horrors with unwavering courage. Finally, after hours of relentless searching, she found it. A small entry in a regimental history, a brief mention of a Lieutenant Edward Burns, who had been awarded a medal for bravery during the Second Battle of Ypres. The entry stated that he had been wounded in action and transferred to a field hospital in France. There was no further information. Vivian felt a surge of excitement, mixed with a growing sense of dread. He had been wounded, but had he survived? The lack of further information was both tantalizing and terrifying. She needed to know more. She needed to find out what had happened to him. She copied down the information, her hand trembling slightly. The librarian, seeing her excitement, smiled knowingly. "It's a start, dear," she said. "But the search may lead you down many paths. Be prepared for both joy and sorrow." Vivian nodded, her throat tight with emotion. She knew the librarian was right. This was just the beginning. She had found a whisper of Edward Burns, a faint echo of his existence. But the journey to uncover his full story, to understand his connection to her grandmother, was far from over. She left the library, the setting sun casting long shadows across the city streets. The watch, tucked safely in her purse, felt heavier now, imbued with a deeper significance, a connection to a past that was slowly, painfully, coming into focus. The whispers of the Western Front were calling, and she knew she had to follow, no matter where they led. The chill of the autumn wind reminded her that unlike the stories within those hallowed halls, hers was just beginning, and the ending was a complete mystery. Chapter 3. A fateful encounter at Bellevue. The next logical step, Vivian realized, was to trace Edward's medical records. If he had been wounded and transferred to a field hospital, there had to be some record of his treatment, his recovery, or his death. The thought sent a shiver down her spine. She was becoming increasingly invested in the search, in the life of this man she had never met. He felt less like a stranger now, more like a distant relative, a lost connection waiting to be found. She decided to start with Bellevue Hospital. It was one of the largest and oldest hospitals in the city, and it had served as a major receiving center for wounded soldiers returning from Europe. She imagined the chaos, the constant influx of injured men, the overworked doctors and nurses, the air thick with the smell of antiseptic and fear. The hospital was a sprawling complex of buildings, a city within a city. Vivian felt a sense of unease as she entered the main building, the sheer scale of the place, the constant activity, the muffled cries of pain, all contributing to a feeling of overwhelming sadness. She approached the records department, a small, cluttered office tucked away in a quiet corner of the hospital. A stern-looking woman, with her hair pulled back in a tight bun and a pair of spectacles perched precariously on her nose, sat behind a large desk, surrounded by stacks of files and ledgers. "May I help you?" she asked, her voice sharp and efficient. Vivian explained her quest, her voice slightly trembling. She showed her the inscription on the watch, the information she had gleaned from the library. The woman listened patiently, her expression unchanging. "We have thousands of records, Miss Price," she said finally. "Finding information about a specific soldier, especially one from several years ago, is like searching for a needle in a haystack." Vivian's heart sank. She had anticipated this, but hearing it spoken aloud made the task seem even more daunting. "But surely there must be some way to narrow it down," she pleaded. "He was a lieutenant, wounded at Ypres. He would have been transferred here, most likely." The woman sighed, a hint of weariness in her eyes. "We can try," she said, "but I can't make any promises. It will take time, and there's no guarantee of success." Vivian spent the next few days at Bellevue, working alongside the records clerk, sifting through mountains of paperwork. The records were a grim chronicle of the war's toll, a testament to the suffering and sacrifice of countless young men. She read about shattered limbs, horrific burns, shell shock, and the agonizing effects of gas poisoning. The reality of war, the brutal, unromantic truth of it, was laid bare before her. She found records of soldiers who had recovered, who had returned home to their families, their lives forever changed. She found records of soldiers who had died, their names etched in cold, impersonal ink. Each entry, each name, was a story of hope and despair, of courage and loss. She kept searching, driven by a growing sense of urgency, a feeling that she was getting closer to Edward, to the truth. She imagined him here, in this hospital, wounded and afraid, perhaps longing for home, for someone to care for him. She wondered if her grandmother had been that someone. Had she been a nurse here? Had she tended to his wounds, comforted him in his pain? On the third day, as she was about to give up hope, she found it. A small, faded card, tucked away in a box of miscellaneous records. It was a medical transfer form, filled out in a hurried, almost illegible hand. It listed the name, Lieutenant Edward Burns, 16th Infantry Regiment. The diagnosis, gunshot wound, left shoulder. Severe. The destination, Bellevue Hospital, New York City. The date, July 12, 1916. Vivian felt a jolt of electricity run through her. This was it. This was him. She had found him. She looked up at the records clerk, her eyes wide with excitement. "I found him," she exclaimed. "I found Edward Burns." The woman, usually so stoic, allowed herself a small smile. "Well done, Miss Price," she said. "You have perseverance." But the card revealed something else, something that sent a chill down Vivian's spine. In the section marked next of kin, a name was written, in the same hurried hand, Beatrice Price, Bellevue Hospital, New York City. Vivian stared at the card, her mind reeling. Beatrice Price. Her grandmother. It was her. She had been here. She had known Edward Burns. She had been listed as his next of kin. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fall into place, but the picture they were forming was far more complex, far more intimate than she had ever imagined. The records clerk, sensing Vivian's shock, gently took the card from her hand. "It seems your grandmother was more involved than you thought, Miss Price," she said softly. Vivian could only nod, her throat tight with emotion. She felt a profound sense of connection to her grandmother, a connection that transcended time and death. She had always admired Beatrice's strength, her independence, but now she saw a different side of her, a side that had been hidden, locked away in the past. A side that had known love, loss, and perhaps a secret that she had carried with her to her grave. The encounter, not of strangers, but of intertwined destinies, was now clear. But what had happened next remained to be uncovered. It was a fateful encounter, yes, but one whose ending remained shrouded in the mists of time and war. The weight of the watch in her bag felt suddenly lighter. She was closer. Much, much closer. Chapter 4. The Shadow of Ypres. The revelation that her grandmother had been Edward Burns's next of kin had thrown Vivian's world into a gentle chaos. She had always known Beatrice as a fiercely independent woman, a suffragette, a social activist, a woman who had seemingly dedicated her life to causes rather than to personal relationships. The idea that she had been intimately connected to a soldier, a wounded lieutenant, was both shocking and profoundly moving. Vivian returned to her grandmother's house, the attic now a place of renewed significance. She needed to find something, anything, that would shed more light on this hidden chapter of Beatrice's life. She searched through boxes of old letters, photographs, and diaries, her hands trembling with anticipation. She found a small, leather-bound diary, its pages yellowed and brittle with age. The handwriting was unmistakably Beatrice's, elegant and precise, even in her youth. The entries were sporadic, mostly focused on her work at the hospital, her involvement in the suffrage movement, and her observations of the war's impact on the city. Then she found it. A series of entries from the summer of 1916, the period when Edward Burns had been at Bellevue. Beatrice wrote about a wounded lieutenant, a brave and gentle soul who had captured her attention. She described his injuries, his quiet strength, his dark eyes that held a hint of sadness. She wrote about their conversations, their shared laughter, their growing connection. He speaks of Ypres, Beatrice wrote in one entry, of the mud, the blood, the constant fear. He says he saw things no man should ever see. He carries the shadow of it with him, even here, in this sterile white room. Vivian felt a pang of sympathy for Edward, for the horrors he had endured. She could almost picture him, lying in a hospital bed, his body broken, his spirit wounded. She could understand why Beatrice had been drawn to him, why she had felt compelled to care for him. Beatrice's entries became more personal, more intimate. She wrote about her growing feelings for Edward, her admiration for his courage, her attraction to his quiet vulnerability. She described the stolen moments they shared, the whispered conversations, the fleeting touches that sent shivers down her spine. "I find myself thinking of him constantly," she wrote. "I worry about him. I pray for him. I think I am falling in love with him." Vivian's heart ached for her grandmother. She had never known this side of her, this romantic, vulnerable side. She had always seen Beatrice as a pillar of strength, a woman who needed no one. But now, reading these words, she realized that Beatrice had been just as human, just as susceptible to love and loss as anyone else. The diary entries painted a vivid picture of their relationship, a blossoming romance amidst the backdrop of war and suffering. They had found solace in each other's company, a brief respite from the darkness that surrounded them. They had shared dreams, hopes, and fears, their bond forged in the crucible of shared experience. But the shadow of Ypres loomed large over their relationship. Edward was a soldier, his duty called him back to the front lines. Beatrice knew this, and she dreaded the day he would have to leave. "He talks of returning to his men," she wrote. "He feels a responsibility to them, a loyalty that cannot be broken. I understand, but it breaks my heart." The diary entries ended abruptly. There was no mention of Edward's departure, no final farewell. Vivian searched frantically for another diary, another clue, but she found nothing. It was as if that chapter of Beatrice's life had been deliberately closed, sealed off from the world. Vivian felt a profound sense of frustration, of incompleteness. She had uncovered a love story, a hidden romance, but the ending was missing. Had Edward returned to the front? Had he survived the war? Had he and Beatrice ever seen each other again? The questions haunted her. She needed to know what had happened to them. She needed to find the missing pieces of the puzzle. She decided to return to the library, to delve deeper into the records of the 16th Infantry Regiment. She needed to trace Edward's movements after he left Bellevue, to find out his fate. The shadow of Ypres had fallen upon her, too. She was now fully immersed into their past. It was dark and heavy, and she knew she had to see the light, if there was any, at its end. She owed it to Edward, to Beatrice, and to herself. The ticking of the watch on her wrist was no longer a gentle rhythm. It was the hurried, insistent pulse of a story demanding to be told. Chapter 5. Letters Across the Sea. The New York Public Library had become Vivian's second home. The hushed atmosphere, the scent of old books, the sense of uncovering hidden histories, all drew her back, day after day. She was determined to trace Edward's journey after he left Bellevue, to find out what had happened to him and, ultimately, to understand the full extent of his relationship with her grandmother. She focused her research on the 16th Infantry Regiment, poring over battle reports, casualty lists, and personal accounts from soldiers who had served alongside Edward. She learned about the regiment's involvement in some of the war's most brutal battles, the Somme, Verdun, Passchendaele. The names were synonymous with unimaginable horror, with staggering loss of life. The more she learned, the more she feared for Edward. She imagined him back in the trenches, facing the constant threat of death, the relentless shelling, the mud, the blood, the despair. She wondered if he had ever thought of Beatrice, if he had carried her memory with him, a beacon of hope in the darkness. She discovered that Edward had indeed returned to the front lines in the fall of 1916. He had rejoined his regiment in France and had participated in several major offensives. He had been promoted to captain, a testament to his leadership and bravery. But the records also revealed that he had been wounded again, this time more seriously, during the Battle of the Somme. Vivian felt a sharp pang of anxiety.
The Somme.
She had read about the horrific casualties, the sheer scale of the destruction. She held her breath as she searched for further information, her heart pounding in her chest. She found a brief mention of Edward in a casualty report. Captain Edward Burns, 16th Infantry Regiment, severely wounded, shell explosion. Transferred to a field hospital near Amiens.
Amiens.
Another name that resonated with the echoes of war. Vivian knew that many field hospitals were located near the front lines, often makeshift structures, ill-equipped to deal with the overwhelming number of wounded. She imagined Edward lying in a crowded tent, surrounded by other injured men, the air thick with the sounds of pain and the smell of death. She needed to know what had happened to him after Amiens. Had he recovered? Had he been sent back to the States? Or had he died there alone and far from home? She decided to shift her focus to another source of information: letters. She knew that soldiers often wrote letters home, to their families, their loved ones. She hoped that Edward might have written to Beatrice, that their correspondence might shed light on his fate. She searched through the library's vast collection of wartime letters, a treasure trove of personal stories, of love, loss, and longing. She read letters from soldiers to their wives, their mothers, their sweethearts. The letters were filled with expressions of hope, fear, courage, and despair. They were a window into the hearts and minds of the men who had fought in the war, a testament to their resilience and their humanity. After days of searching, she found it, a small collection of letters, bundled together with a faded ribbon. The letters were addressed to Miss Beatrice Price, Bellevue Hospital, New York City. The return address: Captain Edward Burns, 16th Infantry Regiment, American Expeditionary Forces, France. Vivian's heart leaped with excitement. These were Edward's letters to Beatrice. She had found them. She carefully untied the ribbon, her hands trembling with anticipation. The letters were dated from the fall of 1916 to the spring of 1918. She began to read. The letters were a revelation. Edward wrote about his experiences in the trenches, the horrors he had witnessed, the friends he had lost. He wrote about his longing for Beatrice, his love for her, his hope that they would be reunited one day. "My dearest Beatrice," he wrote in one letter, "your letters are my lifeline, my connection to a world beyond this madness. They give me strength, they give me hope, they remind me of what I am fighting for." Vivian felt tears welling up in her eyes as she read Edward's words. She could feel his love for Beatrice, his longing for her, his desperation to survive the war and return to her. The letters also revealed the depth of their relationship. They had shared a profound connection, a love that had blossomed amidst the chaos and suffering of war. They had found solace in each other's arms, a brief respite from the darkness that surrounded them. But the letters also contained a growing sense of foreboding. As the war dragged on, Edward's tone became more somber, more resigned. He wrote about the futility of the fighting, the senseless loss of life, the growing disillusionment among the soldiers. "I fear this war will never end, Beatrice," he wrote in one letter. "I fear we are all doomed to perish in this godforsaken place." The last letter in the collection was dated April 1918. It was shorter than the others, written in a shaky hand. "My dearest Beatrice," it began, "I am writing this from a hospital near the front. I have been wounded again. This time I do not know if I will survive. I want you to know that I love you, that I have always loved you. You are the light of my life, the only thing that has made this hell bearable. If I do not see you again, know that I will carry your love with me, always." Vivian's heart shattered as she read the final words. The letter ended there. There was no signature, no farewell. Just a chilling silence. She was left hanging in the dark, the final lines of the letter casting a palpable fear over the quiet library. What came next was unknown, and the foreboding was crushing. She had letters across the sea, yes, but the final destination of their writer was still a haunting, open question. Chapter 6. The Spy Among Us. The abrupt ending of Edward's last letter left Vivian reeling. The ambiguity of his fate, the chilling possibility that he had perished in a field hospital in France, was almost unbearable. She had to know what had happened. She felt a responsibility, a deep-seated need to uncover the truth, not just for herself, but for Beatrice, for Edward, for all those who had been touched by the war's devastating reach. She decided to explore a new avenue of inquiry. Beatrice's diary had mentioned her involvement in various war-related activities beyond her nursing duties at Bellevue. She had been a vocal supporter of the war effort, participating in rallies, raising funds, and volunteering for various organizations. Vivian wondered if Beatrice's activism might have somehow intersected with Edward's military service. She returned to the library, this time focusing her research on wartime organizations, espionage activities, and the complex network of intelligence gathering that had operated both in the United States and in Europe during the war. She knew it was a long shot, but she had a nagging feeling, a sense of intuition, that there was more to the story than she had yet uncovered. She delved into the records of the American Protective League, a quasi-official organization that had worked with the government to identify and suppress dissent, to root out spies and saboteurs. She learned about the pervasive fear of German espionage, the widespread paranoia that had gripped the nation during the war. She also researched the various intelligence agencies that had operated in Europe, the complex web of spies, double agents, and informants who had played a crucial, often unseen, role in the conflict. She read about the challenges of communication, the risks of betrayal, the constant threat of exposure and capture. As she sifted through the records, a name began to surface repeatedly: Heinrich Schmidt. He was a German-American businessman who had been suspected of espionage, of passing sensitive information to the enemy. He had been under surveillance by the American Protective League, but he had never been formally charged. He had seemingly vanished without a trace in the spring of 1918. Vivian felt a prickle of unease. The timing of Schmidt's disappearance coincided with Edward's last letter, with his final, ambiguous message. Could there be a connection? She searched for more information about Schmidt, digging deeper into the archives, following the faint trail of clues. She discovered that Schmidt had been a frequent visitor to Bellevue Hospital, ostensibly to visit wounded German-American soldiers. But the records also revealed that he had met with several other individuals at the hospital, including Beatrice Price. Vivian's heart skipped a beat. Beatrice and Schmidt? What was the nature of their connection? Was it innocent, or was there something more sinister at play? She found a report from an APL operative who had been assigned to monitor Schmidt's activities. The report mentioned a meeting between Schmidt and Beatrice at a small cafe near the hospital. The operative had noted that Beatrice had seemed nervous and agitated during the meeting. She had passed Schmidt a small package, which he had quickly concealed in his coat. Vivian felt a growing sense of dread. What had Beatrice given to Schmidt? Was it possible that her grandmother, the woman she had always admired for her patriotism and her integrity, had been involved in espionage? The thought was almost too much to bear. She struggled to reconcile the image of Beatrice, the dedicated nurse, the passionate suffragette, with the possibility that she had betrayed her country, that she had aided the enemy. But the evidence was mounting. She found another report, this one detailing a raid on Schmidt's office. The agents had found coded messages, maps of military installations, and a list of names, including Edward Burns. Vivian gasped. Edward's name on a list found in a suspected spy's office? What did it mean? Was he a target? Was he somehow involved in Schmidt's activities? Or was he the one who had reported Schmidt, who had uncovered the espionage ring? The questions swirled in her mind, creating a vortex of confusion and uncertainty. She felt as if she were caught in a web of deceit, a tangled network of secrets and lies. She needed to find answers, and she needed to find them fast. She decided to take a risk. She contacted a former APL operative, an elderly man named Mr. Henderson, who had been involved in the investigation of Schmidt. She hoped that he might be able to shed some light on the case, to provide some insight into Beatrice's and Edward's involvement. Mr. Henderson was reluctant to talk at first. He was wary of revealing old secrets, of reopening old wounds. But Vivian's persistence, her genuine desire to uncover the truth, eventually won him over. He invited her to his home, a small, cluttered apartment filled with mementos of his past. He listened patiently as Vivian recounted her story, her voice filled with a mixture of hope and trepidation. When she finished, Mr. Henderson leaned back in his chair, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and understanding. "Miss Price," he said softly, "the war was a time of great deception, of hidden agendas, of divided loyalties. Things were not always what they seemed." He paused, took a deep breath, and continued, "Your grandmother, Beatrice Price, was a good woman. A brave woman, caught in circumstances that were far larger and more deadly than she could image. And Edward Burns. He was no spy." The weight of those words, the no spy, echoed in the quiet room. The spy was among them, yes, but it was not who Vivian feared. It was someone else, someone much closer, and the revelation would turn her search and her world upside down. Chapter 7. Stolen Moments in the Rain. Mr. Henderson's words, "Edward Burns was no spy," hung in the air, a stark contrast to the swirling suspicions that had consumed Vivian. He went on to explain, his voice a low rumble, that Edward had, in fact, been working against Schmidt. He had been recruited by a clandestine branch of military intelligence, tasked with infiltrating Schmidt's network and gathering information about his activities. It was a dangerous game, Mr. Henderson said, his gaze distant, as if he were reliving those perilous times. Schmidt was a slippery character, well-connected and ruthless. Edward had to be extremely careful, walking a tightrope between gaining Schmidt's trust and avoiding exposure. Vivian listened intently, her mind racing to process this new information. Edward, a spy hunter. It made a strange kind of sense, explaining his bravery, his quiet intensity, his ability to compartmentalize his emotions. But it also raised new questions. What was Beatrice's role in all of this? Had she known about Edward's secret mission? Mr. Henderson revealed that Beatrice had been, unknowingly, a key part of Edward's operation. Schmidt had been using her, exploiting her compassion for wounded soldiers, to gain access to the hospital and to gather information. He had manipulated her, preying on her desire to help, to make a difference. She was a pawn, Mr. Henderson said, his voice filled with regret. A good woman, used by a bad man. She had no idea what Schmidt was really up to. The package that Beatrice had given to Schmidt, the one that had been observed by the APL operative, had contained medical supplies, bandages, and painkillers, items that were in high demand on the black market. Schmidt had convinced Beatrice that they were destined for needy German-American families, but in reality, he had been selling them for profit, using the proceeds to fund his espionage activities. Vivian felt a wave of relief wash over her. Her grandmother had not been a traitor. She had been a victim, a dupe, manipulated by a cunning and unscrupulous spy. But the revelation also brought a new layer of sadness, a sense of the profound injustice that Beatrice had suffered. Mr. Henderson explained that Edward had been aware of Schmidt's manipulation of Beatrice. He had tried to protect her, to shield her from the truth, but he had also been forced to use her, to maintain his cover, to gather the evidence he needed to expose Schmidt. It was a terrible burden for him, Mr. Henderson said. He cared deeply for your grandmother. He hated deceiving her, but he had no choice. He was following orders, serving his country. Vivian could only imagine the emotional turmoil that Edward must have endured, torn between his love for Beatrice and his duty to his mission. He had been forced to play a dangerous game, to deceive the woman he loved, to risk her safety in order to achieve a greater good. Mr. Henderson then revealed a detail that sent a jolt of surprise through Vivian. He had been the one who had recruited Edward into military intelligence. He had recognized Edward's potential, his sharp mind, his courage, his unwavering loyalty. He had trained him, guided him, and ultimately sent him on a mission that had changed his life forever. I saw him a few times after he was wounded at Ypres, Mr. Henderson said. He came to my office, seeking a way to continue serving, even though he was no longer fit for combat. He was determined to do his part, to fight the enemy in any way he could. It was during one of those visits, Mr. Henderson recalled, that Edward had spoken about Beatrice. He had described her as an angel of mercy, a woman who had given him hope, who had shown him kindness and compassion in a world filled with darkness. He told me he was in love with her, Mr. Henderson said, a faint smile playing on his lips. He said she was the reason he was fighting, the reason he was willing to risk everything. Vivian felt tears welling up in her eyes. She had a sudden, vivid image of Edward and Beatrice, stealing moments together amidst the chaos of the hospital, finding solace in each other's arms, their love a fragile flame flickering in the darkness of war. She imagined them walking in the rain, sharing an umbrella, their hands brushing, their eyes meeting, their hearts beating as one. She imagined them whispering secrets, sharing dreams, making promises that they knew might never be fulfilled. She imagined them finding a quiet corner in the hospital garden, a secluded spot where they could escape the constant noise and activity, where they could be alone, just for a few precious moments. She imagined Edward gently touching Beatrice's face, tracing the curve of her cheek, his eyes filled with love and longing. She imagined Beatrice leaning in to kiss him, her lips meeting his, a soft, tender kiss that spoke volumes, a kiss that transcended the pain and suffering that surrounded them. She imagined the rain falling around them, a gentle curtain that shielded them from the world, a world at war, a world that threatened to tear them apart. These stolen moments, these fleeting glimpses of love and connection, were all they had. They were a testament to their resilience, their courage, their unwavering belief in the power of love to overcome even the darkest of times. The rain, a constant presence in the war-torn landscape, had also been a witness to their love, a silent confidant to their whispered promises. But the war was relentless and, as Mr. Henderson would soon reveal, it held a devastating secret of its own. It was that secret which would finally reveal the fate of Edward Burns. Chapter 8. Scars of the Somme. Mr. Henderson paused, his gaze shifting to a framed photograph on his desk. It showed a group of young men in uniform, their faces smiling, their arms around each other's shoulders. He pointed to one of the men, a tall, lean figure with dark hair and a familiar, penetrating gaze. "That's Edward," he said, his voice softening. "Taken just before they shipped out to France. He was a good man, a brave soldier. He deserved a better fate." Vivian leaned closer, studying the photograph, her heart aching for the young man in the picture, for the life he had lived, for the love he had shared with her grandmother. She wondered what had happened to him after that last, fateful letter, the one that had ended so abruptly, so ominously. Mr. Henderson took a deep breath, as if preparing himself to deliver a blow. Edward's mission was successful, he said. He gathered enough evidence to expose Schmidt and his network. Schmidt was arrested, along with several of his accomplices. They were tried and convicted of espionage. Vivian felt a surge of relief, a sense of justice served. Edward had accomplished his mission. He had risked his life, and he had succeeded. But the relief was short-lived. But Edward, Mr. Henderson hesitated, his voice cracking with emotion. He didn't make it. He was caught in a shell explosion, just days before the armistice. He died in a field hospital near Amiens, the same one he mentioned in his last letter. Vivian felt as if the air had been sucked out of the room. She stared at Mr. Henderson, her mind struggling to process the words. Edward was dead. He had died so close to the war's end, so close to the possibility of returning home, to Beatrice. The tears that had been threatening for so long finally spilled over, streaming down her cheeks. She felt a profound sense of loss, a grief that was both personal and universal. She grieved for Edward, for Beatrice, for all those who had been lost in the war, for all the shattered dreams and broken promises. Mr. Henderson reached out and gently placed his hand on hers. "I'm sorry, Miss Price," he said softly. "I know this is difficult, but you should know that Edward died a hero. He saved countless lives, and he helped to bring an end to a terrible war." Vivian nodded, her throat tight with emotion. She knew that Mr. Henderson was right. Edward had been a hero. He had sacrificed his life for his country, for his love, for a cause greater than himself. But the knowledge didn't lessen the pain. the sense of profound loss. Mr. Henderson then revealed a detail that added another layer of tragedy to Edward's story. He had been carrying a small, leather-bound book with him when he was wounded. It was found among his personal effects and returned to Mr. Henderson. It was a book of poetry, Mr. Henderson said. He had inscribed it to your grandmother. He had written a message on the inside cover. To Beatrice, my love, my light, my life. Always and forever, Edward. Vivian's heart ached. She could almost picture Edward writing those words, his hand trembling, his heart filled with love and longing. He had carried Beatrice's memory with him, a talisman, a reminder of the life he hoped to return to. Mr. Henderson reached into a drawer and pulled out a small, worn book. He handed it to Vivian. It was the book of poetry, the one that Edward had inscribed to Beatrice. Vivian carefully opened the book, her fingers tracing the faded inscription. She recognized the handwriting, the same elegant script she had seen in Edward's letters. She felt a profound connection to him, to his love for her grandmother, to the tragedy of their unfulfilled dreams. She began to read the poems, her voice choked with emotion. They were love poems, filled with expressions of longing, devotion, and hope. They were a testament to Edward's deep and abiding love for Beatrice, a love that had transcended the horrors of war, a love that had endured until his final breath. As she read, she noticed something tucked between the pages. It was a small, folded piece of paper. She carefully unfolded it. It was a photograph, a faded image of Edward and Beatrice, standing together in the hospital garden, their arms around each other, their faces radiant with love. Vivian stared at the photograph, her heart overflowing with emotion. It was a tangible proof of their love, a stolen moment captured in time, a reminder of the happiness they had shared, however briefly. She realized then that it wasn't just the psalm that had scarred Edward. It was the entire war, the constant threat of death, the separation from the woman he loved, the knowledge that their future together was uncertain, at best. He carried those scars, both physical and emotional, until his dying breath. And Beatrice, Vivian now understood, had carried her own scars, the scars of loss, of grief, of a love that had been cut short by the cruel hand of fate. She closed the book gently, holding a tangible link to a love forged and broken by the fires of war. The photograph, she knew, she'd keep forever. It was proof that their love had existed, and that, in itself, was a victory. But Mr. Henderson had one more piece of information to deliver, and it was a piece that would change everything once again. Chapter 9. Promises Under a Shattered Sky. There's one more thing, Miss Price, Mr. Henderson said, his voice hesitant, as if he were reluctant to reveal the final piece of the puzzle. After Edward's death, I received a letter from a nurse who had been stationed at the field hospital in Amiens. Vivian looked up, her heart pounding in her chest. She had a feeling that this letter, this final communication, held the key to understanding the full extent of Edward's and Beatrice's story. The nurse, her name was Sarah Watkins, wrote that she had been with Edward in his final hours. Mr. Henderson continued. She said that he had been delirious, calling out for Beatrice, repeating her name over and over again. Vivian felt a wave of sadness wash over her. She could almost picture Edward, lying in a hospital bed, his body ravaged by war, his mind clinging to the memory of the woman he loved. Sarah wrote that Edward had given her a message for Beatrice, Mr. Henderson said. He had asked her to tell Beatrice that he loved her, that he would always love her, and that he was sorry he couldn't keep his promise. Vivian's breath caught in her throat. His promise. What promise? The promise to return to her? The promise to marry her? The promise to build a life together? Mr. Henderson reached into his desk drawer again and pulled out a small, sealed envelope. It was addressed to Miss Beatrice Price, Bellevue Hospital, New York City. The return address, Sarah Watkins, American Expeditionary Forces, France. This is the letter, Mr. Henderson said, handing it to Vivian. It was never delivered. After the war, Sarah tried to find Beatrice, but she couldn't. She eventually sent the letter to me, hoping that I might be able to locate her. I tried, too, but I failed. Vivian took the envelope, her hands trembling. This was the letter that had been lost for so many years, the letter that contained Edward's final message to Beatrice. She felt a profound sense of responsibility, a duty to finally deliver this message, to close the circle, to bring peace to their long-lost love. She carefully opened the envelope, her heart aching with anticipation. The letter was written in a delicate, feminine hand, the ink faded but still legible. "My dearest Miss Price," the letter began, "I am writing to you with a heavy heart. I was a nurse at the field hospital in Amiens where Lieutenant Edward Burns was brought after being wounded. I was with him in his final hours." Vivian paused, her eyes filling with tears. She could almost feel Sarah's presence, her compassion, her sadness, her desire to comfort a grieving woman she had never met. "Lieutenant Burns was a brave and gentle man," the letter continued. "He spoke of you often, of his love for you, of his hope that he would one day return to you. He was delirious much of the time, but he kept repeating your name over and over again. It was clear that you were the most important person in his life." Vivian's tears flowed freely now, streaming down her cheeks. She felt a deep connection to Sarah, to this unknown woman who had witnessed Edward's final moments, who had shared in his pain, who had tried to bring him comfort. In a moment of lucidity, the letter continued, "Lieutenant Burns gave me a message for you. He asked me to tell you that he loved you, that he would always love you, and that he was sorry he couldn't keep his promise. He said, 'Tell her I kept my other promise. Tell her I kept it until the very end.'" Vivian's heart stopped. His other promise. What other promise? The promise to love her? That couldn't be it. He had already said that. What else had he promised her? The answer came to her in a flash of insight, a sudden, blinding realization. The watch. The inscription, Lieutenant Edward Burns. He had promised to keep the watch, to carry it with him as a reminder of their love, of their connection, of the moment in time they had shared. He had kept that promise. He had carried the watch with him until the very end. It had been found among his personal effects, a tangible symbol of his love, his loyalty, his unwavering devotion. Vivian looked down at the watch, still resting on her wrist. The hands, frozen at 5:37 p.m., suddenly seemed to hold a new significance, a deeper meaning. They were not just a reminder of a moment in time, but a testament to a promise kept, a love that had endured, a connection that had transcended death. The sky outside Mr. Henderson's window was shattered, fragmented by the buildings of the city. But in that moment, Vivian felt as if she were looking at a different sky, a sky filled with stars, a sky that stretched across time and space, connecting her to Edward, to Beatrice, to a love story that had finally found its ending. It was a bittersweet ending, filled with loss and regret, but also with a sense of peace, of closure, of understanding. The promises made under a shattered sky had been kept in their own way. And the watch, the timekeeper's secret, had finally revealed its truth. But the revelation of the other promise led to an unsettling, unasked question. Who had the watch? And how did it get back to New York? Mr. Henderson, she realized, was staring at the watch on her wrist with a look of stunned recognition. Chapter 10. The Unseen Enemy. Mr. Henderson's gaze was fixed on Vivian's wrist, on the watch that had become the central thread in this intricate tapestry of love and loss. His eyes, usually filled with a calm, almost detached wisdom, were now wide with a mixture of surprise and something else. Something that looked like fear. Where did you get that watch?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Vivian, taken aback by his reaction, explained how she had found it in her grandmother's attic, tucked away in a drawer, a forgotten relic of a past she was only now beginning to understand. Mr. Henderson stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. He walked over to a locked cabinet, his movements stiff and unsteady. He fumbled with the key, his hands trembling slightly. He opened the cabinet and pulled out a small, wooden box. He placed the box on the table in front of Vivian. "This was returned to me after the war," he said, his voice strained, "along with Edward's other personal effects. It was supposed to be delivered to your grandmother, but he paused, his gaze averted, as if he were ashamed to admit something. "I couldn't do it," he said. "I couldn't face her. I couldn't bear to tell her the truth about Edward's death, about the circumstances surrounding it." Vivian's heart pounded in her chest. What was he talking about? What truth? What circumstances? Mr. Henderson opened the box. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was a watch. An identical watch. The same military design, the same leather strap, the same frozen hands, pointing to 5:37 p.m. Vivian stared at the watch, her mind reeling. 2 watches. 2 identical watches. Both inscribed with Edward's name. Both frozen at the same time. It was impossible. It made no sense. "I don't understand," she said, her voice trembling. "How can there be 2? Mr. Henderson sighed, his shoulders slumping with the weight of a long-held secret. "The watch you found in your grandmother's attic," he said, "is a fake. A replica. It was created by Schmidt as part of his elaborate deception." Vivian felt a chill run down her spine. Schmidt, the spy. The man who had manipulated Beatrice, who had used her for his own nefarious purposes. He had created a fake watch? But why? Mr. Henderson explained that Schmidt had been planning to frame Edward, to make it appear as if he were the spy, not Schmidt himself. He had created the replica watch, intending to plant it as evidence, to implicate Edward in his espionage activities. The watch was a key part of his plan, Mr. Henderson said. He had intended to use it to discredit Edward, to turn him into a scapegoat. He had even gone so far as to create fake documents, linking Edward to known German agents. Vivian's mind raced. She remembered the list of names found in Schmidt's office, the list that had included Edward's name. It had all been a setup, a carefully orchestrated plan to frame an innocent man. But why 5:37? Vivian asked, her voice barely a whisper. Why that specific time? Mr. Henderson explained that 5:37 p.m. was the time of a crucial meeting, a meeting between Schmidt and a high-ranking German official. Schmidt had intended to plant the fake watch at the scene of the meeting, making it appear as if Edward had been there, that he had been the one meeting with the enemy. It was a clever plan, Mr. Henderson said. Diabolically clever. If Edward hadn't exposed Schmidt when he did, he would have been arrested, tried, and most likely executed as a traitor. Vivian felt a surge of anger, of revulsion, toward Schmidt. He had been willing to sacrifice an innocent man, to ruin his life, to destroy his reputation, all to save his own skin. But there was still one piece of the puzzle that didn't fit. How had the fake watch ended up in Beatrice's possession? Had Schmidt given it to her? Had she found it? Or had someone else placed it there, deliberately, to mislead her, to keep her from learning the truth about Edward's death? After Schmidt's arrest, Mr. Henderson said, the authorities confiscated all of his belongings, including the fake watch. It was supposed to be destroyed, along with the other evidence. But somehow it disappeared. Vivian's eyes widened. The fake watch had disappeared. And then, years later, it had reappeared in her grandmother's attic. Someone had taken it. Someone had placed it there. But who? And why? The unseen enemy, it seemed, was not just Schmidt. There was someone else, someone who had been working in the shadows, someone who had a vested interest in keeping the truth hidden. The realization sent a shiver down Vivian's spine. The answer, she suspected, was closer than she thought. And it was connected, somehow, to the abrupt ending of Beatrice's diary, to the missing years, to the secrets that her grandmother had carried with her to her grave. The 2 watches ticked, but only one held the true time of Edward's sacrifice. Chapter 11. Betrayal in the Moonlight. The existence of the fake watch, the deliberate attempt to frame Edward, and its subsequent disappearance, pointed to a conspiracy that went far beyond Schmidt. Vivian felt a growing sense of unease, a feeling that she was walking into a dangerous, uncharted territory. Who had taken the fake watch? Who had placed it in her grandmother's attic? And what was their motive? She decided to re-examine Beatrice's diary, searching for any clue, any hint, that might shed light on this new mystery. She focused on the period after Edward's departure from Bellevue, the time when he had returned to the front lines. The entries were sparse, filled with a sense of longing, of anxiety, of waiting. Then she found it. A small, cryptic entry, dated just a few weeks before Edward's death. Received a strange visit today, Beatrice had written. A man I did not know. He claimed to be a friend of Edward's. He brought me a gift, a watch. He said it was a memento, a reminder of Edward's love. I was suspicious, but I accepted it. I don't know why. Vivian's heart skipped a beat. The fake watch. The man who had claimed to be Edward's friend. He had given it to Beatrice, deliberately planting it, knowing that she would keep it, that she would treasure it as a reminder of her lost love. But who was this man? And why had he done it? Vivian realized that she needed to identify this mysterious visitor. She needed to find out who he was, what his connection to Edward and Schmidt had been, and what his motive was in deceiving Beatrice. She returned to Mr. Henderson, hoping that he might have some information, some insight that could help her. She showed him the diary entry, the description of the man, the watch. Mr. Henderson's face paled. He recognized the description. He knew who the man was. His name was Arthur Davies, Mr. Henderson said, his voice strained. He was one of my operatives. He worked with Edward on the Schmidt case. Vivian was stunned. One of Mr. Henderson's own operatives? A man who had worked alongside Edward? He had been the one who had given Beatrice the fake watch? But why? Mr. Henderson explained that Davies had been a double agent. He had been working for Schmidt all along, feeding him information, betraying Edward, betraying his country. I had no idea, Mr. Henderson said, his voice filled with remorse. I trusted him. I thought he was loyal. But he was playing a double game, a very dangerous game. Vivian felt a wave of anger wash over her. Davies, a traitor, a man who had betrayed Edward, who had deceived Beatrice, who had manipulated her grief, her love, for his own selfish purposes. Mr. Henderson explained that Davies had been motivated by greed. Schmidt had promised him a large sum of money, a share of the profits from his espionage activities. Davies had been willing to betray his country, his colleagues, his friends, for money. After Schmidt's arrest, Mr. Henderson said, Davies panicked. He knew that he would be exposed, that his treachery would be revealed. He decided to disappear, to cover his tracks. He took the fake watch, intending to use it as leverage as a way to blackmail someone or perhaps to sell it to the highest bidder. But why had he given it to Beatrice? What was his motive? Mr. Henderson had a theory. He believed that Davies had been in love with Beatrice. He had been jealous of Edward, of their relationship. He had seen an opportunity to exploit Beatrice's grief, to win her over, to replace Edward in her affections. He was a twisted man, Mr. Henderson said. He was obsessed with your grandmother. He thought that by giving her the fake watch, by pretending to be Edward's friend, he could somehow win her love. Vivian felt a surge of disgust. Davies had not only betrayed his country, he had also preyed on a grieving woman, exploiting her vulnerability, her love, for his own twisted desires. But Davies's plan had backfired. Beatrice had been suspicious of him, of the watch. She had sensed that something was wrong, that he was not who he claimed to be. She had never fully trusted him, and she had never fallen for his deception. She had likely placed it there, as she said, unsure why, but feeling the unease it created. The diary entry ended with a chilling sentence. I saw him again, tonight, lurking in the shadows near the hospital. He was watching me. I am afraid. Vivian felt a shiver run down her spine. Davies had been stalking Beatrice, watching her, waiting for an opportunity to what? To harm her? To silence her? To steal the watch back? It had all happened under a clouded, moonlit sky, the betrayal cloaked in the darkness of the night. The betrayal in the moonlight had been twofold: Davies's betrayal of his country and his friend, and his betrayal of Beatrice's trust, her love. It was a betrayal that had far-reaching consequences, a betrayal that had cast a long shadow over Beatrice's life, over Edward's memory, over Vivian's own search for the truth. Mr. Henderson looked at Vivian and stated, we caught him, not long after that entry. He was trying to flee the country. He's been in prison ever since. The moonlight, it seemed, had illuminated his treachery, leading to his downfall. But the damage was done. And Vivian knew that the repercussions of that betrayal were still being felt, even now, decades later. Chapter 12. Echoes of a Lost Battalion. The revelation of Arthur Davies's treachery, his betrayal of Edward and Beatrice, had been a devastating blow. But it had also provided Vivian with a crucial piece of the puzzle, a missing link in the chain of events that had shaped their lives and, ultimately, her own. She now understood the significance of the fake watch, the deliberate deception, the motive behind Davies's actions. But there was still one question that lingered, one mystery that remained unsolved. What had happened to Edward's real watch? Mr. Henderson had told her that the real watch had been returned to him after the war, along with Edward's other personal effects. He had placed it in a locked cabinet, intending to give it to Beatrice, but he had never been able to bring himself to do it. But the watch was no longer in the cabinet. Mr. Henderson had shown her the empty box, the faded velvet lining that had once held the precious memento. Where was it? Who had taken it?
And why?
Vivian felt a renewed sense of urgency, a determination to find the real watch, to reunite it with Beatrice's memory, to bring closure to their long-lost love story. She realized it may be her only way to trace what truly happened in those final days. She decided to focus her search on the hospital on Bellevue. It was the place where Edward and Beatrice had met, where their love had blossomed, where their lives had been forever intertwined. She felt a strong intuition, a sense that the answer to the mystery of the missing watch lay somewhere within those walls, within the echoes of the past. She returned to Bellevue, this time with a different purpose. She was no longer searching for records, for documents, for historical data. She was searching for something more intangible, more personal, more elusive, a connection to Edward, to Beatrice, to their shared history. She walked through the halls of the hospital, her senses heightened, her mind attuned to the whispers of the past. She imagined Edward and Beatrice walking those same halls, their hands brushing, their eyes meeting, their hearts beating as one. She visited the hospital garden, the place where they had stolen moments together, the place where their love had blossomed amidst the chaos and suffering of war. She sat on a bench, beneath the shade of an old oak tree, and closed her eyes, trying to imagine them there, together, sharing their dreams, their hopes, their fears. She spoke to the older nurses, the ones who had been at Bellevue for many years, the ones who might remember Beatrice, who might have heard stories about her, about Edward, about their relationship. She learned that Beatrice had been a beloved figure at Bellevue, a dedicated nurse, a compassionate caregiver, a woman who had touched the lives of countless patients and colleagues. She had been known for her kindness, her generosity, her unwavering commitment to her profession. But she had also been known for her sadness, for the quiet melancholy that had haunted her, for the sense of loss that she had carried with her, always. The nurses spoke of a lost love, a soldier who had died in the war, a man who had captured Beatrice's heart, a man she had never forgotten. Vivian listened to their stories, her heart aching for Beatrice, for the pain she had endured, for the love she had lost. She felt a profound connection to her grandmother, a sense of shared grief, of shared longing. One of the nurses, an elderly woman named Mrs. O'Malley, remembered Beatrice particularly well. She had been a young nurse at Bellevue during the war, and she had worked alongside Beatrice, witnessing her relationship with Edward firsthand. They were so in love, Mrs. O'Malley said, her voice filled with a wistful sadness. It was a beautiful thing to see, amidst all the ugliness of war. They were like two stars, shining brightly in the darkness. Mrs. O'Malley recalled that Beatrice had worn a watch, a man's watch, on her wrist always. She had never taken it off, even after Edward's death. It had been a constant reminder of him, a tangible symbol of their love. It was a beautiful watch, Mrs. O'Malley said. Military style, with a leather strap. I remember her saying it had belonged to him, that he had given it to her before he left for France. Vivian's heart skipped a beat. The real watch. Beatrice had worn it always. But where was it now? Mrs. O'Malley then revealed a detail that sent a shiver down Vivian's spine. She remembered that Beatrice had been working the night shift on a particularly busy evening, a night when a large number of wounded soldiers had been brought in from the front. One of these soldiers had been part of what the papers called the Lost Battalion, a group of men from the 77th Division who'd become trapped and isolated. There had been a terrible battle, Mrs. O'Malley said. So many casualties. The hospital was overwhelmed. We were working around the clock, trying to save as many lives as we could. She recalled seeing Beatrice tending a particular soldier that stood out, not just for his wounds, but because of his delirious state. And it was then, Mrs. O'Malley remembered, that Beatrice had taken off the watch and fastened it around his wrist. She'd spoken softly to him, almost as if in a dream, and left it there. Vivian felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of understanding. Beatrice hadn't lost the watch. She had given it away. She had given it to a dying soldier, a man who reminded her of Edward, a man who needed a symbol of hope, of love, of connection in his final hours. The echoes of a lost battalion, of a lost love, had converged in that moment, in that act of selfless compassion. But who was that soldier? And did he, in fact, die? That information, Vivian knew with grim certainty, lay in one place, and one place only. Chapter 13. The Price of Freedom. The image of Beatrice giving Edward's watch to a dying soldier, a member of the famed Lost Battalion, haunted Vivian. It was an act of profound compassion, of selfless love, a gesture that spoke volumes about Beatrice's character, her unwavering empathy, her ability to find beauty and connection even in the darkest of times. But who was that soldier? Did he know the significance of the watch? Did it bring him any solace in the face of death? Vivian was determined to find out. She returned to the Bellevue Records Department, this time with a specific focus: the Lost Battalion. She needed to find the names of the soldiers who had been brought to Bellevue on that fateful night, the night Beatrice had given away the watch. The records clerk, the same stern-faced woman Vivian had encountered before, was initially reluctant to help. The records were old, incomplete, and difficult to access. But Vivian's persistence, her genuine desire to uncover the truth, eventually wore her down. The Lost Battalion, the clerk said, her voice softening slightly. A tragic story. So many young men, lost, trapped, forgotten. They fought bravely, against overwhelming odds. Many of them didn't make it. She led Vivian to a dusty archive room, filled with stacks of old ledgers, files, and documents. They spent hours poring over the records, searching for any mention of the Lost Battalion, any clue that might lead them to the soldier who had received Beatrice's gift. They found lists of names, casualty reports, medical records, transfer forms. The sheer volume of information was overwhelming, a grim reminder of the war's devastating toll. Vivian felt a growing sense of despair, a fear that she would never find the answer she was seeking. Then, as they were about to give up hope, they found it. A small, faded card, tucked away in a box of miscellaneous records. It was a medical intake form, filled out in a hurried, almost illegible hand. The name on the card: Private James O'Connell, 77th Infantry Division, 308th Infantry Regiment. The diagnosis: multiple gunshot wounds. Severe shock. Unconscious. The date: October 8th, 1918. Vivian's heart skipped a beat. October 8th, 1918. That was the night Beatrice had given away the watch. Private James O'Connell. Could this be him? Could this be the soldier who had received Beatrice's precious gift? The card revealed further details. Private O'Connell had been found, barely alive, in a shell crater near the Argonne Forest. He had been clinging to life, his body riddled with bullets, his uniform torn and blood-stained. He had been brought to a field hospital and then transferred to Bellevue. Vivian felt a surge of hope, mixed with a growing sense of dread. He had been severely wounded, unconscious. Had he survived? Had he ever regained consciousness? Had he known anything about the watch, about Beatrice, about Edward? The records clerk found another document, a follow-up report, dated a few days later. It stated that Private O'Connell had undergone emergency surgery at Bellevue. He had survived the surgery, but he remained in critical condition. He was suffering from severe infections, internal bleeding, and profound shock. The report ended with a chilling sentence: prognosis, extremely poor. Vivian's heart sank. It seemed unlikely that Private O'Connell had survived. He had been too badly wounded, too close to death. The watch, it seemed, had been given to a man who was destined to die, a man who would never know the story behind it, the love that it represented. But then they found one more document, a small, handwritten note attached to Private O'Connell's file. It was dated several weeks later, after the armistice, after the war had ended. The note was written by a nurse, a different nurse than the one who had written the previous report. It stated that Private O'Connell had made a miraculous recovery. He had defied the odds. He had fought his way back from the brink of death. He had survived. Against all expectations, the note read, "Private O'Connell has shown remarkable resilience. He is still weak, but he is conscious, alert, and responsive. He has asked about a watch, a man's watch, that he was wearing when he was brought in. He seems to believe it brought him luck." Vivian felt a surge of emotion, a mixture of relief, joy, and disbelief. Private O'Connell had survived. He had lived. And he remembered the watch. He believed it had brought him luck. The note ended with a final sentence. "Private O'Connell has been transferred to a convalescent home in upstate New York. He is expected to make a full recovery." Vivian felt a profound sense of closure, of peace. The watch, Edward's watch, had not been lost. It had been given to a man who had needed it, a man who had valued it, a man who had believed in its power. It had served its purpose. It had brought hope, comfort, and perhaps even a miracle. The price of freedom, Vivian realized, had been paid by so many, in so many ways. Edward had paid it with his life. Beatrice had paid it with her love. And Private O'Connell had paid it with his suffering, his resilience, his unwavering will to survive. She smiled. The watch had done its work. But where was he now? Finding him, she suspected, would complete a circle she hadn't even fully realized she'd been tracing. Chapter 14. A desperate gamble. The news that Private James O'Connell had survived, that he remembered the watch, and that he had been transferred to a convalescent home in upstate New York, filled Vivian with a renewed sense of purpose. She had to find him. She had to talk to him. She had to learn what he knew about the watch, about Beatrice, about those final, fateful days of the war. She obtained the name and address of the convalescent home from the hospital records, the Hudson Valley Restorative Center, near Poughkeepsie, New York. It was a long shot, she knew. This was 1917, and O'Connell had been there in late 1918. He could have been discharged, moved, or died in the intervening years. But she had to try. She felt a compelling need to complete this journey, to bring closure to this long-lost love story, to finally understand the full extent of Edward's and Beatrice's sacrifice. She also knew that finding O'Connell could very well mean finding Edward's real watch. She decided to take a train to Poughkeepsie, a journey that took her through the scenic Hudson Valley, a landscape of rolling hills, verdant forests, and charming villages. The beauty of the countryside was a stark contrast to the grim realities of war that she had been immersed in for so long. The Hudson Valley Restorative Center was a large, stately building set amidst sprawling grounds, overlooking the Hudson River. It was a peaceful, tranquil place, a haven for those recovering from the physical and emotional wounds of war. Vivian approached the main entrance, her heart pounding with anticipation. She spoke to the receptionist, a kind-faced woman with a warm smile. She explained that she was looking for information about a former patient, a Private James O'Connell, who had been there in 1918. The receptionist checked the records, her brow furrowing slightly. "I'm sorry, Miss Price," she said. "We have no record of a James O'Connell being here in recent years. He may have been discharged a long time ago." Vivian's heart sank. She had come all this way, only to reach another dead end. She felt a surge of disappointment, of frustration. But then, the receptionist added, "However, we do have an older record of a James O'Connell. He was discharged in 1919. It does say he remained in the area. Let me see." Vivian held her breath, her hopes rekindled. The receptionist consulted a large, leather-bound ledger, its pages filled with handwritten entries. She scanned the pages, her finger tracing the lines of text. Yes, here it is, she said, her voice brightening.
James O'Connell.
Discharged, April 1919. He gave a local address. A farm, just outside of town. She wrote down the details for Vivian on a small slip. Vivian thanked the receptionist profusely, her heart filled with a renewed sense of hope. She had an address, a lead, a chance to finally find Private O'Connell, to learn the final chapter of Edward's and Beatrice's story. She took a taxi to the address, a farm located on the outskirts of Poughkeepsie. It was a modest farmhouse, surrounded by fields, orchards, and a weathered barn. A sense of peace and tranquility permeated the air, a stark contrast to the bustling city she had left behind. She approached the farmhouse, her heart pounding in her chest. She knocked on the door, her hand trembling slightly. A woman answered the door, an elderly woman with kind eyes and a weathered face. She looked at Vivian with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. "May I help you?" she asked, her voice gentle but firm. "I'm looking for Mr. James O'Connell," Vivian said, her voice slightly hesitant. "I believe he used to live here." The woman's expression changed, a flicker of sadness crossing her face. "James was my husband," she said. "He passed away a few years ago." Vivian felt a pang of disappointment, but not surprise. It had been many years since the war. It was likely that Private O'Connell was no longer alive. But, she knew, someone in this house might still hold the final key. "I'm so sorry to hear that," Vivian said. "My name is Vivian Price. I'm researching a story about the war, about a soldier named Edward Burns. I believe your husband may have known him." The woman's eyes widened slightly. "Edward Burns?" she said. "My James spoke of him often. He said he owed him his life." She paused, then added, "Come in, Miss Price. Please. I'm Mary O'Connell." It was a desperate gamble, this journey, but it had paid off. She was one step closer, one conversation away, from uncovering the final truth. And that truth, she suspected, was waiting for her inside that humble farmhouse, nestled amongst the memories of a life lived, a debt repaid, and a watch that had finally found its way home. Chapter 15. The Nightingale's Song. Mary O'Connell led Vivian into the farmhouse, a cozy, welcoming space filled with the scent of freshly baked bread and the warmth of a crackling fireplace. Family photographs adorned the walls, chronicling a life filled with love, laughter, and the quiet joys of rural living. "Please sit down, Miss Price," Mary said, gesturing towards a comfortable armchair near the fireplace. "Can I offer you some tea? Or coffee?" Vivian accepted the offer of tea, grateful for Mary's hospitality. She felt a sense of calm settle over her, a feeling of being in the right place, at the right time. As Mary prepared the tea, Vivian explained her quest, her search for information about Edward Burns, her discovery of the watch, her connection to Beatrice Price. She spoke about the letters, the diary, the revelations about espionage, the heartbreaking story of a love lost to war. Mary listened intently, her eyes filled with a mixture of understanding and sadness. She had heard stories about Edward Burns, about his bravery, his kindness, his tragic death. James had spoken of him often, with reverence and gratitude. "James always said that Edward saved his life," Mary said, handing Vivian a cup of steaming tea. "He said that if it hadn't been for Edward, he wouldn't have made it out of that shell crater alive." Vivian explained about the watch and asked the all-important query, "Did your husband ever talk about a watch? A man's watch that an army nurse had given him?" Mary's eyes lit up. "The watch," she exclaimed. "Yes, he treasured that watch. He wore it every day of his life, until he couldn't anymore." Vivian's heart leaped with excitement. The real watch. James O'Connell had had it. He had worn it. He had valued it. "Where is it now?" Vivian asked, her voice filled with anticipation. Mary's expression changed, a shadow of sadness crossing her face. It's gone," she said. "James was buried with it." Vivian felt a wave of emotion wash over her, a mixture of disappointment, relief, and a profound sense of closure. The watch, Edward's watch, had finally found its resting place. It had been returned to its rightful owner, in a way. It had accompanied James O'Connell on his final journey, a symbol of the bond between two soldiers, a testament to the enduring power of love and sacrifice. Mary explained that James had always felt a deep connection to the watch, to the unknown soldier who had given it to him. He had believed that it had brought him luck, that it had protected him, that it had given him the strength to survive. He never knew who the nurse was, Mary said. He always wondered about her, about the soldier who had owned the watch. He wished he could have thanked them, told them how much it meant to him. Vivian felt tears welling up in her eyes. She realized that she was the one who could finally fulfill James's wish. She could tell him, through Mary, the story of Edward and Beatrice, the story of their love, their sacrifice, their enduring connection. She told Mary everything. She told her about Beatrice's diary, about Edward's letters, about their stolen moments in the hospital garden, about their dreams, their hopes, their fears. She told her about Edward's bravery, his secret mission, his tragic death. She told her about Beatrice's unwavering love, her enduring grief, her lifelong commitment to honoring Edward's memory. Mary listened in silence, tears streaming down her cheeks. She was deeply moved by the story, by the revelation of the watch's true significance, by the connection between her husband and these two extraordinary individuals. James always felt like he was living on borrowed time, Mary said, her voice choked with emotion. He felt like he had been given a second chance at life, and he was determined to make the most of it. He always said he was living for two, for himself and for the soldier who didn't make it. Vivian nodded, her heart overflowing with understanding. James O'Connell had honored Edward's memory, not just by wearing the watch, but by living a full and meaningful life, by embracing love, by cherishing every moment. Mary then shared a detail that sent a shiver down Vivian's spine. She said that James had always had a recurring dream, a dream about a woman, a nurse, singing to him in a hospital. He said she had the voice of an angel, Mary said. He called her his nightingale. He said she sang him back to life. Vivian's heart stopped. The nightingale. Beatrice. James had dreamt of Beatrice, of her voice, of her presence. He had remembered her, subconsciously, even though he had never known her name, never known her story. The nightingale's song, it seemed, had reached across time and space, connecting two souls, uniting them in a shared experience of trauma, healing, and love. It was a song of hope, a song of resilience, a song of the enduring power of the human spirit. And James, unknowingly, had answered it. Vivian knew then that her journey was complete. The circle was closed. She had finally found all of the scattered pieces. But there was one final task to perform. Chapter 16. The Long Road to Verdun. Vivian knew what she had to do. She had to visit Edward's grave. She had to pay her respects, to tell him, in her own way, that his story had been heard, that his love had been remembered, that his sacrifice had not been in vain. She asked Mary for directions to the nearest military cemetery, the place where American soldiers who had died in France were buried. Mary told her that many of the soldiers from that region had been laid to rest in the Meuse-Argonne American Cemetery, near Verdun. Verdun. The name resonated with the echoes of one of the war's most brutal and protracted battles. It was a place of immense suffering, of unimaginable loss, of staggering courage. Vivian felt a sense of trepidation, but also a sense of determination. She had to go. She had to complete this pilgrimage, this final act of remembrance. She thanked Mary for her kindness, for her hospitality, for sharing her husband's story. She promised to stay in touch, to keep the memory of James and Edward and Beatrice alive. She took a train to France, a long and arduous journey that mirrored, in a way, the journey that so many young men had taken during the war, a journey from which many of them had never returned. The Meuse-Argonne American Cemetery was a vast, sprawling expanse of white crosses, stretching as far as the eye could see. It was a sobering sight, a stark reminder of the war's devastating toll, a testament to the countless lives that had been lost. Vivian walked among the rows of crosses, her heart heavy with grief, her mind filled with the images of the young men who lay beneath, their dreams, their hopes, their futures cut short by the brutal realities of war. She searched for Edward's grave, her eyes scanning the names, the dates, the inscriptions. She felt a growing sense of anxiety, a fear that she might not find him, that he might be lost among the thousands of others. Then she saw it. A simple white cross, bearing the inscription, Lieutenant Edward Burns, 16th Infantry Regiment, died October 28, 1918. Vivian stood before Edward's grave, her tears flowing freely. She felt a profound sense of connection to him, to this man she had never met, this man who had loved her grandmother, this man who had sacrificed his life for his country. She spoke to him, softly, her voice choked with emotion. She told him about her journey, about her search for the truth, about her discovery of his love for Beatrice, about the watch, about Private O'Connell. "I found him, Edward," she said. "I found the soldier who received your watch. He lived. He lived a long and full life. He remembered you. He honored your memory." She told him about Beatrice, about her unwavering love, her enduring grief, her lifelong commitment to honoring his memory. She told him that Beatrice had never forgotten him, that she had carried his love with her, always. "She gave your watch away," Vivian said, "to a dying soldier. It was an act of kindness, of compassion, of love. She wanted to give him hope, to give him comfort, to give him a connection to something beautiful, something enduring. She placed a small bouquet of flowers on his grave, a symbol of her respect, her gratitude, her love. She stood there for a long time, in silence, her heart overflowing with emotion. The long road to Verdun had been a journey of discovery, of healing, of remembrance. It had been a journey that had taken her across continents, across time, across the boundaries of life and death. It had been a journey that had brought her closer to her grandmother, closer to Edward, closer to the truth. As she turned to leave, she noticed something glinting in the sunlight, near the base of the cross. It was a small, metallic object, half buried in the earth. She bent down to pick it up. It was a button. A military button from an American uniform. It was tarnished, weathered, but still recognizable. Vivian felt a jolt of recognition. She had seen a button like this before. In one of the photographs of Edward, the one Mr. Henderson had shown her. He had been wearing a uniform with buttons just like this one. Vivian realized, with a sudden, overwhelming certainty, that this button had belonged to Edward. It had been lost here, on this very spot, when he had been buried. It was a tangible link to him, a physical reminder of his presence, a final gift from beyond the grave. It was a small thing, an insignificant thing, perhaps, but to Vivian, it was a treasure. It was a symbol of Edward's enduring spirit, of his unwavering courage, of his eternal love. The journey was complete, but one final task remained in New York. Chapter 17. Beneath a Flag of Truce. Vivian returned to New York, carrying with her the button she had found at Edward's grave, a tangible link to the past, a symbol of love, loss, and remembrance. She felt a sense of peace, of closure, but also a sense of responsibility. She had one final task to perform, one final act of reconciliation to complete. She knew she had to tell Beatrice's story, and she needed to make amends, in whatever small way, for Arthur Davies's actions. He was still alive, still in prison, and Vivian knew, with a certainty that had been building since Mr. Henderson's revelations, she had to go see him. She contacted the prison authorities, requesting permission to visit Arthur Davies. It was a long shot, she knew. Davies was an old man now, and he had been incarcerated for decades. He might not be willing to see her, to talk to her, to revisit the painful memories of the past. To her surprise, her request was granted. Davies had agreed to see her. Vivian felt a mixture of trepidation and determination. She was about to come face to face with the man who had betrayed Edward, who had deceived Beatrice, who had caused so much pain and suffering. The prison was a grim, imposing structure, a place of confinement, of punishment, of lost hope. Vivian felt a sense of unease as she entered the building, the heavy doors clanging shut behind her, the sounds of echoing footsteps and muffled voices filling the air. She was escorted to a small, sparsely furnished visiting room, a sterile space with bare walls and a single table and 2 chairs. She sat down, her heart pounding in her chest, her hands trembling slightly. After a few minutes, the door opened, and Arthur Davies entered the room. He was an old man now, frail and gaunt, his eyes hollow, his face etched with the lines of regret and remorse. He looked nothing like the dashing, debonair spy Vivian had imagined. He was a broken man, a shadow of his former self. He sat down across from Vivian, his gaze fixed on the table, as if he were ashamed to meet her eyes. "Miss Price," he said, his voice raspy and weak. "I was surprised to hear from you. I didn't think anyone remembered me anymore." Vivian took a deep breath. "I'm Beatrice Price's granddaughter," she said. "I've been researching her life, her connection to Edward Burns." "I know what you did." Davies flinched, his body tensing slightly. He finally looked up at Vivian, his eyes filled with a mixture of shame and sorrow. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm so sorry. For everything. I was a fool. A greedy, selfish fool. I betrayed everyone. I betrayed my country. I betrayed my friends. I betrayed the woman I cared for." Vivian felt a surge of anger, of revulsion, towards Davies. But she also felt a sense of pity, of compassion. He was a broken man, a man who had lived with the consequences of his actions for decades, a man who had been consumed by guilt and regret. "Why did you do it?" Vivian asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Why did you betray Edward? Why did you deceive Beatrice?" Davies explained, his voice halting and filled with emotion. He spoke of his greed, his ambition, his desire for wealth and power. He spoke of his obsession with Beatrice, his jealousy of Edward, his desperate attempt to win her love. "I thought I could have it all," he said. "I thought I could be rich, powerful, and have the woman I loved. But I was wrong. I was so wrong. I destroyed everything. I lost everything." Vivian listened in silence, her heart aching for Beatrice, for Edward, for all those who had been affected by Davies's treachery. "I know I can't undo what I did," Davies said. "I know I can't make amends for the pain I caused. But I want you to know that I'm truly sorry. I've lived with this guilt every day of my life. It's been my punishment, my torment." Vivian looked at Davies, his frail body, his haunted eyes, his trembling hands. She saw a man who had been consumed by his own demons, a man who had paid a heavy price for his sins. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the button, the one she had found at Edward's grave. She placed it on the table, in front of Davies. "This belonged to Edward," she said. "I found it at his grave, in France. I thought you should see it." Davies stared at the button, his eyes widening in disbelief. He reached out and touched it, gently, his fingers tracing its tarnished surface. "He was a good man," Davies said, his voice choked with emotion. "A brave man. He didn't deserve what happened to him. I was the one who should have died." Vivian nodded, her throat tight with emotion. "I know," she said. They sat in silence for a few minutes, the button lying between them, a symbol of betrayal, of forgiveness, of reconciliation. It was, in a way, a flag of truce, a sign that the war between them, the war within Davies, was finally over. The price of freedom had been paid, by Edward, by Beatrice, by James, and, in his own way, by Arthur Davies. And now, beneath the metaphorical flag of truce, represented by that small, tarnished button, a new kind of peace had been declared. Chapter 18. The Heart's Reckoning. Vivian left the prison with a heavy heart, but also with a sense of liberation. She had faced Arthur Davies, she had heard his confession, she had offered him a measure of forgiveness. It was a difficult, emotionally draining encounter, but it was also a necessary one. It was a step towards healing, towards closure, towards understanding. She returned to her apartment, the familiar comfort of her surroundings a welcome balm to her frayed nerves. She felt exhausted, drained, but also strangely energized. She had come so far, she had uncovered so much, she had learned so much about her grandmother, about Edward, about the enduring power of love and sacrifice. She sat down at her desk and began to write. She wanted to tell Beatrice's and Edward's story, to share it with the world, to honor their memory, to ensure that their love, their courage, their sacrifice would never be forgotten. She wrote about Beatrice's early life, her involvement in the suffrage movement, her dedication to nursing, her unwavering commitment to helping others. She wrote about Edward's bravery, his secret mission, his tragic death. She wrote about their stolen moments in the hospital garden, their whispered conversations, their shared dreams, their hopes, their fears. She wrote about the watch, the fake watch, the real watch, the symbol of their love, their connection, their enduring bond. She wrote about Private James O'Connell, the soldier who had received Beatrice's gift, the man who had lived a full and meaningful life, honoring Edward's memory. She wrote about Arthur Davies, the betrayer, the man who had caused so much pain and suffering, the man who had ultimately found redemption in his own twisted way. She wrote about the war, the Great War, the war that had changed the world, the war that had taken so many lives, the war that had shaped the destinies of so many. She wrote about love, loss, grief, forgiveness, reconciliation, hope. She wrote about the human spirit, its capacity for both great cruelty and great compassion, its ability to endure, to heal, to find beauty and meaning even in the darkest of times. As she wrote, she felt a sense of peace settle over her, a feeling of connection to Beatrice, to Edward, to all those who had been touched by the war's devastating reach. She felt as if she were channeling their voices, their stories, their emotions, through her words. She wrote for hours, days, weeks, the words flowing from her pen, filling the pages of her notebook, creating a tapestry of love, loss, and remembrance. It was a cathartic experience, a way of processing her own emotions, of coming to terms with the past, of finding meaning in the midst of chaos and uncertainty. She realized, as she wrote, that this story was not just about Beatrice and Edward. It was about her, too. It was about her journey of discovery, her quest for truth, her connection to her family's history, her understanding of the enduring power of love and sacrifice. She had started this journey seeking answers to a mystery, seeking to uncover the secrets of a long-lost watch. But she had found so much more. She had found a connection to her grandmother, a deeper understanding of herself, renewed appreciation for the fragility of life, the importance of love, the enduring power of hope. The heart's reckoning, she realized, was not just about facing the past, about confronting the truth, about finding forgiveness. It was also about embracing the present, about cherishing the relationships that mattered most, about living a life filled with purpose, meaning, and love. She finished the story, her heart overflowing with emotion. She had done it. She had told Beatrice's and Edward's story. She had honored their memory. She had brought closure to their long-lost love story. She looked at her own wrist, bare now, but feeling the phantom weight of a watch that had connected her to a past she would now carry, not on her arm, but in her heart. The reckoning was complete. But one final step remained. Sharing the story. Chapter 19. Twilight of the Gods. Vivian decided to share her story, Beatrice's and Edward's story, with the world. She felt a compelling need to ensure that their love, their sacrifice, their courage would not be forgotten. She wanted to honor their memory, to give their story a voice, to share the lessons she had learned on her journey of discovery. She contacted a publisher, a small, independent press that specialized in historical fiction and nonfiction. She sent them a synopsis of her story, along with a few sample chapters. She was nervous, apprehensive, unsure of how her work would be received. To her surprise, the publisher was enthusiastic. They loved the story, the characters, the historical setting, the emotional depth, the message of hope and resilience. They offered her a contract, a chance to publish her book, to share her story with a wider audience. Vivian was overjoyed. It was a dream come true, a validation of her hard work, her dedication, her passion. She signed the contract, her heart filled with excitement and anticipation. The editing process was challenging, demanding, but also rewarding. She worked closely with an editor, refining her prose, clarifying her narrative, ensuring that the story was both historically accurate and emotionally engaging. She chose a title for the book, The Timekeeper's Secret. It was a fitting title, she felt, a nod to the watch that had started it all, the watch that had led her on this incredible journey of discovery. The book was published a year later, to critical acclaim. Reviewers praised the story, the characters, the writing, the historical detail, the emotional impact. Readers responded enthusiastically, sharing their own stories of love, loss, and remembrance. Vivian received letters and emails from people all over the world, thanking her for sharing Beatrice's and Edward's story, for reminding them of the importance of love, the power of forgiveness, the enduring strength of the human spirit. The book became a bestseller, a testament to the enduring appeal of stories that touch the heart, that explore the complexities of human relationships, that remind us of the importance of cherishing the moments we have, of living a life filled with purpose, meaning, and love. Vivian felt a profound sense of satisfaction, of accomplishment, of gratitude. She had achieved her goal. She had honored Beatrice's and Edward's memory. She had shared their story with the world. She organized a book launch event at the New York Public Library, the place where her journey had begun, the place where she had first discovered the whispers of the past. She invited Mr. Henderson, Mary O'Connell, and some of the nurses from Bellevue Hospital who had known Beatrice. The event was a celebration of love, loss, remembrance, and reconciliation. It was a gathering of people who had been touched by Beatrice's and Edward's story, people who had shared in Vivian's journey of discovery. Mr. Henderson spoke, his voice filled with emotion, about Edward's bravery, his sacrifice, his unwavering commitment to his country. Mary O'Connell spoke about her husband, James, about his gratitude to Edward, about the watch that had become a symbol of hope, of resilience, of a second chance at life. Vivian read excerpts from her book, her voice trembling slightly, her heart overflowing with emotion. She shared the story of Beatrice and Edward, their love, their loss, their enduring connection. She spoke about the importance of remembering the past, of learning from history, of honoring the sacrifices of those who came before us. The event ended with a standing ovation, a tribute to Beatrice and Edward, to Vivian, to all those who had been touched by the war's devastating reach, to all those who had found love, hope, and healing in the midst of chaos and uncertainty. It was like a scene from Valhalla, the twilight of the gods, a gathering of heroes, both living and dead, their stories intertwined, their legacies immortalized. The book was out there a beacon, and she knew, with certainty, it would touch others, just as the story had touched her. Chapter 20. The Dawn After the Storm. Years passed. Vivian continued to write, to share stories, to explore the complexities of human relationships, to delve into the depths of history. The Timekeeper's Secret remained her most successful book, a testament to the enduring power of love, loss, and remembrance. It had been translated into multiple languages, adapted into a film, and had touched the lives of millions of people around the world. Vivian often visited Beatrice's house, the old house in New York, the place where she had first discovered the watch, the place where her journey had begun. She had kept the house, preserving it as a museum of sorts, a tribute to her grandmother, to Edward, to their long-lost love story. She had cleaned and organized the attic, the place where she had found the fake watch, the place where the secrets of the past had been hidden for so long. She had created a small exhibit, displaying the watch, the letters, the diary, the photographs, the buttons she had found at Edward's grave. She often sat in the attic, surrounded by the relics of the past, feeling a sense of connection to Beatrice, to Edward, to all those who had been touched by the war's devastating reach. She would read passages from her book, her voice echoing in the quiet space, bringing their story to life once more. She had also established a foundation in Beatrice's and Edward's names, a charitable organization dedicated to supporting veterans, to providing assistance to those who had been wounded in war, to promoting peace and understanding among nations. She felt a profound sense of responsibility to carry on their legacy, to honor their memory, to make a difference in the world, to ensure that their sacrifices had not been in vain. She often visited the graves of Beatrice and James O'Connell, who were both buried in small, peaceful cemeteries in upstate New York. They were near each other, another symbol of the connection. She would place flowers on their graves, speak to them softly, sharing her thoughts, her feelings, her gratitude. She felt a sense of peace, of closure, of fulfillment. She had done everything she could to honor their memory, to tell their story, to make a difference in the world. She had also found love herself. She had met a man, a historian, who shared her passion for the past, her love of stories, her commitment to making a difference. They had married, built a life together, a life filled with love, laughter, and a shared sense of purpose. She often thought about the watch, the real watch, buried with James O'Connell. It was a symbol of love, of sacrifice, of hope, of resilience. It was a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there is always light, there is always hope, there is always the possibility of healing, of connection, of love. The dawn after the storm, she realized, was not just about the end of the war, the return of peace, the rebuilding of shattered lives. It was also about the enduring power of the human spirit, its ability to overcome adversity, to find beauty and meaning in the midst of chaos and uncertainty, to love, to forgive, to remember. She looked out the window of Beatrice's house, at the city skyline, bathed in the golden light of the rising sun. She felt a sense of gratitude, of hope, of peace. The journey had been long, arduous, challenging, but it had also been rewarding, transformative, life-affirming. She had found the answers she had been seeking. She had uncovered the secrets of the past. She had brought closure to a long-lost love story. She had honored the memory of those who had come before her, and she had found her own place in the world, her own purpose, her own meaning. The storm had passed. The dawn had arrived. And Vivian, standing in the quiet stillness of her grandmother's house, felt the warmth of the sun on her face, the promise of a new day, a new beginning, a new chapter in her own life story. The story all the stories had been told. It was a new day. It was finally time to live. Epilogue. The watch, the real watch, lay buried with James O'Connell, a silent testament to a love story that had spanned continents, endured through war, and resonated across time. It was a symbol of sacrifice, of hope, of the enduring power of the human spirit. It was a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there is always light, there is always love, there is always the possibility of healing. Vivian, standing in the cemetery, looking at the headstone, the gentle breeze caressing it, knew that the story had truly come to an end. But she also knew that the legacy of Beatrice and Edward, of James and Mary, and of all those who had been touched by the Great War, would live on. Their stories would be told, their sacrifices would be remembered, their love would continue to inspire. The ticking of the watch, silenced beneath the earth, had become a heartbeat, echoing through the generations, a reminder of the enduring power of love, the importance of remembrance, and the promise of peace. And as Vivian walked away, she knew that, though the watch was buried, its time, their time, would never truly be over. It would always be 5:37 p.m., somewhere,